Good evening. And we'll have to be quiet tonight because Pesco is fast asleep after having fallen out of the tree. Good evening to Class 3, 4 and 5 for episode 16B of Danny, the Champion of the World. Let's say hello to our characters. There's Danny and his dad. They've just poached 120 pheasants from Hazel's Wood. Evening Rebel. Let's have a look at Danny's dad in action. There he is, holding up some of the pheasants that have just fallen out of the trees. "You did it, Danny," he said. "The whole thing was your idea in the first place." "I didn't do it, Dad." "Oh, yes, you did. And you know what that makes you, dear boy? It makes you the champion of the world." He pulled up his sweater and unwound the two big cotton sacks from round his belly. "Here's yours," he said, handing one of them to me. "Fill it up quick." The light of the moon was so strong I could read the print across the front of the sack. J.W. Crump, it said, Keston Flour Mills, London, SW17. So they're putting all the pheasants in massive, big flour sacks. Now, we were wondering how they were going to get all the pheasants home. But even then, they'd have to carry the bags home. So maybe Dad's got something up his sleeve. "You don't think the keeper with the brown teeth is watching us this very moment from behind a tree?" I said. "No chance," my father said. "If he's anywhere, he'll be down at the filling station waiting to catch us coming home with the loot." We started loading the pheasants into the sacks. They were soft and floppy-necked, and the skin underneath the feathers was still warm. "We can't possibly carry this lot all the way home," I said. "Of course not. There'll be a taxi waiting for us on the track outside the wood." "A taxi?" I said. "My dad always made use of a taxi on a big job," he said. "Why a taxi, for heaven's sake?" "It's more secret, Danny. Nobody knows who's inside the taxi except the driver." "Which driver?" I asked. "Charlie Kinch. He's only too glad to oblige." "Does he know about poaching too?" "Old Charlie Kinch? Of course he does. He's poached more pheasants in his time than we've sold gallons of petrol." We finished loading the sacks and my father humped his onto his shoulders. I couldn't do that with mine. It was just too heavy for me. "Drag it," my father said. "Just drag it along the ground." My sack had 60 birds inside it and it weighed a ton. But it slid quite easily over the dry leaves with me walking backwards and pulling it with both hands. When we came to the edge of the wood and peered through the hedge onto the track, my father said, "Charlie boy," very softly. And the old man behind the wheel of the taxi poked his head out into the moonlight and gave us a sly, toothless grin. We slid through the hedge, dragging the sacks after us along the ground. "Hello, hello, hello," Charlie Kinch said. "What's all this then?" Chapter 17, The Taxi. 2 minutes later, we were safely inside the taxi and cruising slowly down the bumpy track towards the road. My father was bursting with pride and excitement. He kept leaning forward and tapping Charlie Kinch on the shoulder and saying, "How about it, Charlie? How about this for a haul?" And Charlie kept glancing back pop-eyed at the huge bulging sacks of pheasants. "Cripes, man," he kept saying, "how did you do it?" "Danny did it," my father said proudly. "My son Danny is the champion of the world." Then Charlie said, I reckon pheasants are going to be a bit scarce up at Mr. Victor Hazel's opening day shoot tomorrow, eh, William?" "I imagine they are, Charlie," my father said. "I imagine they are." "All those fancy folk," old Charlie said, "driving in from miles around in their big shiny cars, and there won't be a blinking bird anywhere left for them to shoot." Charlie Kinch started chuckling, "Ha ha ha," and chortling so much he nearly drove off the track. "Dad," I said, "what are we going to do with all those pheasants?" "Share them out amongst our friends," my father said. There's a dozen of them here for Charlie to start with." Let's get you a picture of that. "All right, Charlie." "Well, that suits me," Charlie said. "Then there'll be a dozen for Doc Spencer, and another dozen for Enoch Samways. You don't mean Sergeant Samways, do you, Dad? I gasped. Of course, my father said. Enoch Samways is one of my very oldest friends. Ah, Enoch's a good boy, Charlie Kinch said. He's a lovely lad. Sergeant Enoch Samways, as I knew very well, was the village policeman. He was a huge, plump man with a bristly black moustache, and he strode up and down our high street with the proud and measured tread of a man who knows that he is in charge. The silver buttons on his uniform sparkle like diamonds, and the mere sight of him frightened me so much I used to cross over to the other side of the street whenever he approached. Enoch Samways, well, Sergeant Samways, likes a piece of roasted pheasants as much as the next man, my father said. I reckon he knows a thing or two about catching them as well, Charlie Kinch said. I was astounded. Even the police were in on poaching pheasants. I couldn't believe it.